Doris, thank you so much for coming for our virtual studio visit. Thank you so much. That's great. Where are you right now?
I'm in Villa de Leyva, small town, like, I don't know, uh, 150 kilometers from Bogota. And it's very quiet here. And it's a good place to be thinking and reading and drawing.
How has the pandemic been in Colombia? How was
It's
the
been
last?
terrible. It's been terrible. Like in any poor nation, it seems like we development is always something that will never be achieved here. And they say that we have lost like 20 years in terms of the development of the country. So poverty is a big issue, and we have almost 4 million Venezuelan migrants who are having the worst, the most terrible time, like migrants all over the world. But here they are walking, they walk all from Venezuela all the way to Bogota, and in really precarious conditions. So there's no way they can have shelter, they can shelter in, there's no way they can have sanitation, there's no way they can have social distance. So poverty makes, of course, the pandemic feel like a real disaster.
Is vaccination on the way? Did
A
vaccination?
really precarious, very precarious process. We have had like 60,000 vaccines. I mean, it's almost nothing.
God, for a country of 50 million, that's
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, we have a right-wing government that is extremely irresponsible and really disorganized and authoritarian. So we are in a very difficult situation, very, very complex situation.
yeah. Perhaps I always think being an artist, you administer your own time. You go to the studio, you can work, you can make drawings. Has the last year been a pause for you, or a rethinking of how you work and live, or has it been how do you reflect on it?
Well, for me, it's been a good time, I have to say, because I have time to read and to study, um, more time than I ever had before, and that's something I really value, because I need to be a different person every time I begin a piece. So I need to do a lot of reading to be in a different place. I don't want to be the same person repeating myself with the same ideas. So having this time to research and read is being incredibly rich, and I really value it. It's been absolutely wonderful. Also, all of my pieces come first as a drawing. So I've been having the opportunity to draw in perfect silence. I'm quite neurotic. I need to be alone and in silence. And so this time is being ideal for that. So I've been thinking of pieces and in ways that I wasn't able to do before. I think I have learned, and I'm in a different place from where I was at the beginning of the pandemic. And that is good for me.
I remember when I visited you 11 years now, 2010, you told me that since 1948, you were not born then, but all of your life, basically your country has been in a state of emergency, has been in a state of exception. It was always a fight, and it's always survival, and always people disappeared, and you always had to kind of address this. And I also think that the pandemic must be just added to this, because it's already such a complex situation in a way.
So it has always been like that. And at the beginning of my career, I was thinking that I made the conscious decision to work from a country at war. And I wanted that perspective and that trauma to be part of my work. So in a sort of naive way, I was thinking in the late 80s, that that we will eventually get out of this situation. Uh, that we were third world and had the possibility of becoming second, and there was a clear model, and and it was a really naive idea, because now I see that the entire world is becoming more like us. So there's hostility, xenophobia, poverty, inequality growing in the first world, something that I didn't expect. So now the global north has many, many aspects that are similar to the ones we have experienced in the Global South for many years. So the trajectory of my work has been amplified in that sense. Yes, there was war here. By now, I think there is war everywhere. Not only because of terrorism, but because of the precarious conditions of the workers. If you see, or the conditions of migrants in I don't call them refugee camps, but concentration camps. So it's like the situation that I used to think that was unique to Colombia now has become universal, unfortunately.
You grew up in a very political family. Was that informing you to become an artist, or were you at some point thinking you would become a politician or work in society in a different way?
I wasn't that clear when I was a little girl what I wanted to do. My parents used to argue about politics all the time. So there was, and the situation in Colombia has always been critical, always. So there's always a crisis. It's like we are living in an endless catastrophe. So when you experience catastrophe, you are really into it. And so we discuss everything all the time. I was drawn to art because I was really crafty. I could draw in a naturalistic way very easily. And that was all I was interested in doing. So I was a really bad student. I couldn't care less about anything that was in school. And I was drawing all the time, drawing compulsively. And my mother was intelligent enough to understand that that was important. So at age 6, I was already taking drawing lessons.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's even more incredible because my family was quite poor. So I could do it, but she never encouraged it. She never thought it was going to be a professional thing, because coming from a lower middle class family, they wanted me to have a real career. Nonetheless, they supported me all my life.
Oh, that's beautiful. So
Yeah.
when did you have the suspicion growing into conviction that you wanted to be an artist?
I think it was so swift. It was something that was there with me always, because I was always drawing. I don't have a clear moment when I say I want to be an artist. It was always there with me. I don't think it was a choice. It just came to me natural. I don't recall saying, now I'm going to be an artist. No, it was always there. And since nothing else was of interest to me, it was obvious that that was it.
And then you studied at the fine arts in Bogota.
Yeah, I studied fine arts.
And then in the early 80s, you went to NYU. You went to New York and studied.
Yeah, but as I was studying in Bogota, fine arts, then a beautiful Colombian painter, Beatriz Gonzalez, had an art history program. It wasn't formal education, it was not university, but I was doing this as I was doing undergraduate in Colombia. And then when I moved to the States to get my master's degree at NYU, I found a wonderful job at the Fine Art Institute. And my job was to project the slides during the classes. And so I had the most wonderful experience. So for 2 years, I was listening to all the talks, all the seminaries. So art history has always been very important to me. And I was privileged enough, even though I don't have a formal education or a title, I was very close to it.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Did you ever teach in your artist career?
I taught for many years. Many years. I actually started giving lessons when I was very young. I started when I was 21 years old. Then I went to New York, studied, and when I came back, I thought that that it was I never considered the possibility of showing my work, much less of selling my work. So I always thought that I had to support myself by teaching and I was like a part-time artist, and I adore teaching. And I spent all my energy, and I taught in many universities, and it was very important for me. As I was telling you before, I had to stop because I was sacked. I was kicked out of the university when I was teaching.
Oh.
And then I started as a full-time artist.
So we should be very grateful that you became a full-time artist. It's really such incredible work. Let's perhaps start looking at some of the works. I put as the first works, this is from the late 80s. And I put this as the first work because I felt it embodies so many recurrent motifs and so many strategies that you have been following through your career. Do you want to say a bit about this work, Doris?
Yes, every single one of my works is based on a real testimony of a real event. In this case, there was a massacre in this town, and I read, in this case, I did not interview the person, but I read an interview, a very detailed interview of a mother that after a massacre encountered the body of her teenage son on the street. And she was describing the way she cleaned it. She put clean clothes and all this act of protecting something that is impossible to protect, something that has already been destroyed, and even though that life was ended and was finite, her act of cleaning, of making it beautiful, the beauty she found in her son's body, turned this experience into something that goes beyond the life of the son. Something, I think she returned to the body of her son and to her son the humanity that the murderers have taken away. So this was a brutal way of trying to protect the son. Of course, it is something that is impossible to do. It is absurd, but that's why I was waving this metal on this baby's grave.
Yeah, it's such an incredible work. We go to the next, also an early piece here from 1989, 1990. You want to describe a little bit what that's based on?
This, again, is based on a massacre that took place in the banana plantations in the north of Colombia, where an American firm, Chiquita Banana, operated. And the company was hiring paramilitary death squads, right-wing death squads, to kill union workers that have been unionized. So it was the way Chiquita destroyed the union. And the workers were taken into the front of their house and killed in front of the family. And I was thinking, the bed was still warm, and nonetheless, this person was already dead. So my intention with this piece, I think with this piece, I began, also the previous one we saw, I started to develop these acts of mourning. How can a person honor a life, and it's a life that they know is already lost? So for me, it's very important to create this poetics of mourning, and I think all of my work shares this aspect. This is something that appeared very early on, and I have continued working throughout my life. So the fact that this clothing, these shirts, these male shirts, can no longer be used. They have become dysfunctional because these lives have been destroyed, have been wasted. So for me, the number of shirts is important, because the number of lives that have been destroyed are many. This is an astronomical, a horrible figure. And I wanted to show that there is a continuation of that.
Hmm. Right now, we are looking at a body of work here, a photograph in the Carnegie International. That's a body of work you became very known for, and you have shown all over the world in different, of course, also in your retrospectives, but also at the time. And I remember first encountering, we can go perhaps to the next slide, because these are from the same body of work, and perhaps to the next one where we have a detail. So you were at some point, and if we go 2 slides back to see the overall picture of this, filling everyday objects, cupboards and cabinets, connecting them with beds and tables and filling them, making them heavy, giving them this weight that is, you can't really move them anymore. And of course you cannot use them anymore. I always looked at these works because they're both charged. They're charged objects that narrate something, but then there are also abstract sculptures that have a weight, that have a dimension, and they are also ready-mades that you brought into a different context of meaning by your artistic interventions. What brought you to this incredibly important body of work?
Well, this is a body of work in which I worked for over 20 years. I began this body of work by interviewing. Then I was moving I was no longer interviewing in the countryside of Colombia, but interviewing victims. There was a genocide of a political movement in Colombia. The movement was called the Patriotic Union, and almost 4,000 of its members were murdered by the Colombian government. So I was interviewing widows and mothers and parents of people who had been killed. And I was struck there were many parents that had something to say to the children, or wives who have something to say to the murdered husbands, and nonetheless there was only silence. So I thought that concrete was at the time I thought was the most silent material I could find. There is no answer when you face death. There's no dialogue. There's only silence. There's no way you can communicate. There's nothing you can say to that person. There is no response. So for me, it was very important to use concrete in wooden objects and filling them with clothing that still have some of the humanity of the people who own these objects. And nonetheless, they were turned into something completely human. So I wanted to show that it is impossible to retrieve past events. No matter if we think historically, no matter if we try to retrieve memory, if we try to keep memory alive, nothing is important, because once a person is killed, There's no way to go back to the way life was previously. So it is a radical gesture. And I thought that concrete could address that better than any other material. And since these murders continue happening, I continue making these pieces for, as I say, for 20 years.
Whose experience is in the piece? We have a shirt. The shirt might have belonged to a person you heard about or was related to one of. Whose experience is in the piece? Whose story is it?
Well, it's not. When we talk about art, when we enter the terrain of art, everything is paradoxical. So I should say that this is not my experience. This is the experience of the victims of political violence, and I'm trying to research, although I were a detective. I researched every single aspect of these lost lives. I visit the places where they lived. I talked to their families. I tried to walk the trajectories they walked. I tried to pay attention to every single detail of their lives. And based on what I can gather of these lost lives, of this and of the experience of the mourners, I tried to put that into the work. So in a way, I work as though I were schizophrenic. I'm not. I put this my center, my own center, into the center of these mourners, and I see myself from the outside. So
Yeah.
it is not my experience, but the experience has to go through me.
Yeah.
But it is a weird me. It is like an oblivion. I'm oblivious of myself, but
Yeah.
it still goes through me. But it's the experience of the other, of somebody that I didn't know, that I have to find, that I'm trying to go. I'm trying to create an encounter. Of
Yeah.
course, the encounter is not possible, and that's why the work presents silence, because the encounter is not possible. But I try to do it, even though I know it is in vain. I do my best to get into this encounter.
A year later, a year after you did this work, the quite known cartoonist and satirist and public figure Jaime Gaston got killed in Bogota. And you organized, with some of his friends and relatives, you organized hundreds or even thousands of roses, first being hung upside down across where he used to live. And then a year later, you, from the place where he lived to the place where he got killed, you lined up for 2 miles, 4.5 kilometers, you lined up the roses throughout the city. Is that because you sometimes describe your work as impotent? You say as an artist, I feel an impotence, I cannot change it. But you did create a reality with an action like this. Everybody who saw those 2 miles of roses on the floor in the streets will forever remember that.
Yes, yes, but if you think in terms of power, the strongest manifestation of power is murder. So that's why I say that art is powerless in that sense, in that we cannot save from the abyss of death. I cannot save any life. I cannot rebuild any town that has been bombed. There's nothing I can do for these victims in reality. But of course, again, art is paradoxical. I think art has the amazing power to give back some sense, some meaning, and some forms to this life that has been destroyed. So it is both. But of course, I place myself from impotence. I'm completely impotent. It will be is like Walter Benjamin's the angel of history. He watches the world being destroyed. He watches the ruins, and he wishes he could give life back to the death and somehow reconstruct the destruction he sees. And nonetheless, he cannot do it. I think in a way, artists, we are very much like Benjamin's angel of history.
If we look at this work, and perhaps we even go to the next slide, Atraviarios, and my Spanish is very, very rudimentary, and it used to be much, much better 30 years ago, but now it's really not much. But if I try to translate it, there is a certain melancholic feeling in mourning. So there's some melancholy in mourning, in the process of mourning, and you mourning as work and mourning as practice, as a practice in your work and a practice in your performances and a practice in understanding your work. These are basically shoes sewn into little niches in the wall. They are sutured cow bladder skins in front of these. We can go to the next slide just to see a bit more of a detail. That's an ongoing body of work. You started in the early 90s, you did until 2004. I was fortunate enough to install one of these ones. This is such an incredible work. Do you want to give us a bit of your insight into this?
I was interviewing the families of the disappeared in Colombia. We don't have a certain figure of how many people have been disappeared in Colombia, but approximately is 100,000 people. So it is a crime that has really shaped our reality. When you talk to these families, you go to the homes and there are mothers that have not gone out in, let's say, 10 or 15 years, because maybe if they go out, then their son will show up or will make a phone call. There are families that for years and years and years, they set up, when they set the table, there is a plate for the missing person, because they hope that day finally the person will arrive. I was researching one specific case with one human rights lawyer who was later killed. He was murdered in his office. And he brought me to one case that he had entirely unearthed. And it was of a guerrilla woman who went to Bogota for the first communion of a child. And after the party, she went out with a friend, and then she was taken by the army, by the Colombian army, and disappeared. Most of the shoes in this installation are female shoes. There are only a few male shoes, because I realized that for female disappear, the process is even worse. Males usually are interrogated, and tortured, but killed almost immediately, usually the same day or the next day. But women are kept for months, and they are kept and they are being raped, and the whole degradation and the process is really terrible. So that's why I was honoring these women. So the families of the disappeared, mostly women, gave me shoes, and I realized I had no right to intervene these objects, because these objects have a historical value. And so what I did was protecting them in this niche without doing anything to the shoe itself, because I had the first installation I made was with these shoes that were given to me. Then I destroyed the installation and gave these shoes back to the victims. Later on, when I did it with shoes that I found, that I bought, but no longer, only the first one, only on the first installation, the shoes belong to the families. And I think these shoes tell us a lot about the life, about even the personality of the person who is missing. And I think it is absolutely essential for us in countries like Colombia to think of these people, to think of who they were, and to give them some sort of a space. It's not that they disappear in thin air. Somebody took them, somebody killed them. So it is important to give them space. And that's what I was trying to do with this piece.
Yeah, it's an incredibly present piece. And the melancholic feeling that I described before, because just imagining seeing a single shoe on the street, or as is a materiality, and those empty boxes there with a cow bladder translucency. Coming to this body of work, La Casa Viuda, I would translate it not such a good translator. I would try is like the widowed house, if perhaps I'm not exactly matching it. But if we go to the next slide, we see that you interviewed women that were forced to leave their homes. And so what you took out of this leaving their homes were the doors. So here are the doors, and the doors are sculptural. There's an intervention that they stand on themselves. So they stand there, and you insert it. We can also go to the next slide. you basically attached objects. There might be toys, there might be a shirt, there might be. This is such an incredibly strong body of work. How many people did you interview?
Well, there was a bishop who actually was also murdered. This bishop was incredibly brave, and he allowed me to travel with him to these towns where people had been displaced. And there were many houses that were abandoned and many houses that were destroyed. So I picked up some doors from these villages that were abandoned and houses that were destroyed. And he was, as we reached some of these towns, he will ring the bell, and in an hour or so, children will appear, and then the rest of the people will show up in wherever we were, because there were people that were hiding in the bushes, and they will send the children first to make sure it was safe for them to come out. And then these families, as they were displaced in Colombia, I started follow them from city to city to city, because they were forced to be moved, to be displaced several times. It is important to keep in mind that Colombia has 9 million internally displaced people. 9 million. So displacement was, it's again part of our reality, a very strong part of the reality. And as you see, these people were, it conveys all the crimes, because then the paramilitaries or the guerrilla will get to a town, kill usually the men of the family, and then force the women with the children to leave. These people were in many occasions, they were not even able to bury their death. They just had to leave and leave everything behind. Leave alive, leave their house, leave their animals, leave even their death. Um, and so there were usually women that were alone. So every time I made a piece, one of these pieces, I'm quite obedient to the testimonies given by these women, and each piece describes a word or a situation that they mentioned to me in the testimony.
Yeah. Going forward, you did this body of work, Unland, which was based on the testimonies also of orphaned children. And here we have a view of three of the tables showing basically 6 tables being connected to 3 tables at Site Santa Fe in 98, 99. And let's go to the next slide, because we see how you joined these 2 separate tables into one table. And I remember when I visited you in the studio, one of your collaborators, because you have this incredibly collaborative studio with architects and people who dream how to make things real that look completely impossible. And he was describing that you had to make thousands of holes to basically stitch these tables together with hair. So this is kind of, you make a hole, you go with the needles through, and you stitch the tables together. This incredible work, The Orphan's Tunic. How did you even conceive of something that felt like, from the get-go? I was privileged to talk to your studio, and it seemed absolutely impossible to do something like this. How did this occur to you?
Well, as I was interviewing children, as you said, who had witnessed the murder of their parents, and they were images that I will never forget. There was this little girl that I was interviewing, and every day she was wearing the same dress, and the dress was obviously too small for her. One day I arrived like at 5 a.m. to orphanage, and to leave a doll that I had bought for her, and I found her washing the same dress. And then she told me that dress, her mother had made that dress for her, and she had to wear it every single day. And there were so many children, in the same situation, in similar situation, that I was thinking of the waste of life, of the waste of energy, of the waste of love, of the waste of life. And I wanted to make a piece that was an extreme waste of time with the most precarious elements that these poor, poor, very poor people have. And of course, there's nothing, it's like they have nothing beyond their own body. So hair became an important part of this piece. And then of course clothes, because of the dress this little girl was always wearing. So I start this insane, impossible gesture of stitching with hair this orphan tunic into the stables. And it was it's one of the if not the most difficult piece I ever made. Of course, it had to be an absurd, uh, insane, unbearable gesture that was to honor this waste of lives.
Yeah. In 1985, in the Palace of Justice in Bogota, there was an incident where the military, the guerrillas, the government forces, a very traumatic experience, November 6th and November 7th. I think it was, you describe it in one of your essays, you say it was more than a 50-hour, so a little bit more than 2 days incident. And that was obviously very, very traumatic for you. Kind of thinking about you were in your 20s, you lived a couple of blocks, and several of your bodies of work pay homage to this incredible act of brutality, because it was. And let's go to the next slide. We have these stainless steel tables. We go to the next slide. So they are named November 6, 2001. And if we go to the next slide, we will see the building of the Palace of Justice in Bogota, where you then 17 years later, you did this performative work. You started hanging, lowering chairs from the Palace of Justice. And if we go to the next slide, you basically had it in different configurations, sometimes fewer, sometimes more. Was this a project that you were asked to do as a memorial, or was this an idea that grew in you, having experienced the incident of 1985?
Well, yeah, certainly I was not commissioned. I've never been commissioned to anything in Colombia. Oh no, one thing in Colombia, but I was working 2 blocks away from where the Supreme Court, the building of the Supreme Court was, and I heard shotguns, and I ran out of my office in a museum 2 blocks away, and I saw already the army retaliating the guerrilla takeover of the Supreme Court. I stayed for several hours until the army forced me to go home, and I returned the next day. So I witnessed this event that lasted 53 hours. At the beginning, I wasn't able to think of anything. It was too traumatic. There were too many terrible images that I keep from witnessing this terrible event directly. And later, 6 years later, the building had been demolished, but there was a basement full of objects that have the traces of the battle. And I start asking permission to take these objects. And every time I say I need this table that it has traces, bullet holes or whatever, then next time the table will disappear. Next time I visit the table will disappear, and so on and so forth, until every single element that was in this huge basement disappeared, and I was not allowed to take anything. I had planned to make a like a permanent installation in the National History Museum of this event, and I was censored. I was not allowed to do it. So finally, 17 years later, I tried to make this piece in the Palace of Justice. And I sent letters to Supreme Court. I sent letters to the Ministry of Justice. I sent many letters to the Ministry of Culture, and nobody replied to me. So, and the building had amazing security. So one day I entered the building through the garage door, and I was in the basement of the building, not knowing who to talk to, not knowing what to do. And then I saw a little office that said administration, and I entered. I had written something on a statement on what I wanted to do, and I had done some drawings. And there was a man in this office, and I showed to him what I wanted to do, but he said, "Look, I administrate the building. I knew and I loved many of the magistrates and the justices that work here, and I would love that you could do something, but I'm not the person who can give you permission." So he allowed me to go at night and on Sundays and make the work on the roof of the building. So for months I work at night with my team, and on the 4th of November, I had not even received the permission from the Supreme Court. Finally, on the 5th of November, 2002, I received, in that time there were faxes, I received a fax at 6 p.m. Saying, yes, you are allowed to do it. I guess they thought that if they informed me, if they give me permission a few hours before the intended performance, I wouldn't be able to do it. And it was, I always interpreted that as a form of censorship, but I was ready because this architect had allowed me to do everything. So next morning at 11:35 sharp, the first chair was lowered. It was lowered at 11:35 because that was the time when the first person was murdered. It was a guard, the guerrilla, who the guerrilla murdered as they were storming into the building. And then I had the autopsies, you say, of each of some of the bodies that were recovered, and I tried to lower groups of chairs as according to the times of the death of these autopsies, until I pretty much cover the two facades of this corner of the building, of the new building.
What an incredible piece! What an incredible work! If we go further in the slides, Doris, and that was a piece that made me halt, and I feel very fortunate that I witnessed it. We can go to the next slide. And perhaps we stay here for a moment. 2003, Istanbul, the International Biennial in Istanbul. In Istanbul, when you visit Istanbul for the first time, what I was surprised by is you are in the center of the city and right in areas that are completely well-to-do and prosperous and stores. There are these houses that are run down or fell apart, complete ruins, often beautiful wooden houses like from a different era. And often they're just like holes because nothing is left from these houses. And I remember very early on, I asked, why are these ruins in these very, very prosperous areas? Because it's so obvious. And you used one of these, if you go to the next slide, we see a bit more how you did it in detail. Basically, you used it, as one of your collaborators said, you used it like a canvas, like the backside of the canvas. You worked to create a flat surface at the facade of the house to fill it with, in this case, 1,550 chairs. We go to the next slide. It's kind of like this assemblage of chairs. How did this work come about? Because again, you seem to aim at the impossible. I was like even wondering how you would ever get a permission to do this in the inner city of of such a world metropolis. How did this come about?
Well, as I was visiting Istanbul, I noticed the same things you were mentioning, the fact that there were too many ruins, and I wonder why there are so many ruins. Who was the owner of these buildings? Who owned this building? Why did they left it? Why a house, a beautiful building, is abandoned? And then as I was researching and I was interviewing people in the university in Istanbul, historians, then I learned that they were in the 30s and 40s. The Turkish government imposed to its Jewish and Greek minority a tax that was 200, I forgot now, 230 or 340% of their wealth. Obviously, nobody can pay a tax that is 440 of your wealth. So many of these Greek and the Jewish families were sent to forced labor camps, and some were fortunate enough to live and abandon their lives behind. So I wanted to mark that every single space on this planet has been contested violently. There's no one single inch in this planet that has not been fought for, and that has a terrible, sad, violent history behind. I wanted to show how, I want to create like a topography of war that show that the private and the political always collide at war. And I wanted to inscribe this image of war in the middle of everyday normal life, of buildings that were perfect, that were functioning. There were stores. It was a neighborhood that was actually quite lively. So it was very important for me to show how war is part of the fabric of our life, of the space in which we walk every single day, of the space that we inhabit. We need to wonder what happened there. We always need to wonder, because there's always a history of war underneath. So I wanted this to be absolutely flat. If you see it, it's perfectly flat, because I wanted to show that even though it seems like chaotic and irrational, when you see the flatness, you realize that it is rational. And this is very important for me, because I want to show that every act of violence, every single one, is rational. Every single act of violence has been thought. Somebody thought of that. Somebody actually paid the murderers to do it. And this kind of rational thinking and showing how modernity, from its very beginning, has been a rational way of destroying lives, of stealing land, of stealing and exerting out of each human being the last drop of value. I wanted this to be clear, and that's why it is perfectly flat.
It's incredible to learn that the precision, the nearly obsessive precision in your work, of course, matches the precision in the strategies that the perpetrators have.
Yeah.
If we go to the next slide, because you thinking about, this is at a gallery called White Cube. So, and you worked with the idea of the white cube, and what the white cube in its precision is. It's like the idea of the sublime white abstraction, perfect surfaces, perfect angles. And you brought a crack into this idea of the white cube, no pun intended here. So if we go to the next slide here, in 2004, basically, first you might think, is there an intervention? We go to the next slide. And you see in detail what you actually did at White Cube at the gallery, which was, we have talked about that before, which was inspired by Guantanamo, right? It was inspired Let's go back 2 slides and see the entrance of this, because I think this is perhaps the best picture starting to talk about it. Do you want to give us a bit of an insight what made you start conceive of such a subtle, sublime, but also extreme work? Because this is tons of pressure putting this into the gallery walls here.
I guess when I start as an artist, as an art student, it was before Reagan and Thatcher had come along and changed the world. So in a way, I was naive. I was thinking, and I remember thinking, how could people in the 30s and 40s experience concentration camps? Did they know about it? I always wonder, how much did they know? And if they knew about the existence of concentration camps, how come that nobody said anything? How come that nobody stopped this? And then when Guantanamo came about, I was in the same situation as people during the Second World War. So I knew of the existence. There was no way I could avoid knowing of the existence of concentration camps. Then I start going back to the history of concentration camps, and it's a long history. It actually is a Spanish idea. It came about in 1896. This General Martinez Campo thought of putting all the civilian population in an area without food and medicine, and if they were cramped into small spaces, he knew that they were going to die because of infections. And once the Spaniards thought of that and implemented that in Cuba, then everybody did it. The British, the Germans, everybody did it. And I thought it's so easy to blame the Germans for concentration camps. It's so easy, and we never think. And there's a story that is rarely told. It's everywhere. I mean, you can think of the killing fields. Right now, we can think of what is happening in Xinjiang province in China. We know what is happening to the Rohingyas in Myanmar. I mean, it's a presence in our life, and we live with it. So I was thinking, how can I have a house? I have a house this house protects me, and yet I know of the existence of concentration camp. So I wanted to put the image of a space that protects me, that allows me interiority, that allows me to think and to feel, with the utmost image of exteriority, which is a fence, a wire fence. And at the time, there was very little information when I was making this piece about Guantanamo, and I chose this kind of fence because I thought that it worked for what I needed to materially as a sculptor. It worked perfectly, but I never thought that was the one that actually the Americans were using in Guantanamo, because this one cuts. This kind of mesh cuts the hand, and it was good for me because it could cut through the wall. And then years after I made the piece, I found a report that said that exactly this was the mesh used by the Americans to really put these human beings in the worst of conditions. So it is the existence, the awareness of the existence of these spaces where everything can happen, as everything is possible in the concentration. Hannah Arendt said that her definition of concentration camp is a place where everything can happen. So, and the Americans gave it the exact definition. It is a place that is outside the law, and nonetheless, it is by law that these civilians who have not been tried, are forced into indefinitely. So it is a trait of our, it's a mark of our contemporary society. This is the reality that we live in. And we have to be aware of that. We cannot ignore it. No matter how hard we try to induce ignorance into our lives, there are reports everywhere that this is reality. So for me, this piece is very, very important, because it's one of the pieces where I can really set the terms of the lives. It is really define the life that we live.
And it's also so visceral. I heard you say once that for you, art is not about answers, it's about questions. And it's going to a place where writing and words cannot go. It's a place somewhere between thought and desire, or thought and experience, you say. And this, I think, you created this very strong experience in 2004 at White Cube. If we go to the next slide, this would have been if people visited the Castello di Rivoli, the incredible art castle in Torino. They visited during your project, but let's go back in time and forward in slides and look at the next one. So this is this incredibly vaulted gallery at the Castello di Rivoli. And it looks like, because the Castello is in Torino in itself is quite ornate, and you walk into this and you think, oh, they never finished the vaulted ceiling. It looks so raw. And what you did is, because it also feels very oppressive and very heavy, because if this would be a blue sky with clouds and painted, it would be light, but it's since not ornate and it's just bare bricks, it feels so heavy. So what you did again is doing the impossible. You engineered building down a wall from the vaulted ceiling, creating an incredibly oppressive power structure nearly as architecture. Let's go to the next slide. So you built down those vaulted ceiling nearly to the point where it touched the floor, but you could, like we saw, still enter. And I know, knowing the project quite well, I know that you fabricated all the bricks and you hand painted them so that they're exactly like the vaulted ceiling. But a work called The Abyss in Italy, what was this motivated by in 2005 to create a work like this in a castle that was built well beyond the modern times we are talking about right now?
Well, as I was visiting the building, I realized that architecture of power is always, as you say, ornate with clouds and birds and whatever. So you get the feeling that is not oppressive, but it is. So here, seeing it raw made a huge impression on me. At the time, I was researching forced labor imposed on undocumented migrants, and the only way to convey this sterile feeling of slave work was by lowering the walls, so you feel you're trapped, you're entombed in this building. And I was learning about slave work in Europe, and I found that there were millions, approximately 30 million people that are being enslaved in the world, and they are enslaved because we don't care about these lives. They can be enslaved because our indifference allowed the perpetrators to do as they wish. Because once a migrant has lost its status as refugee, as a worker, and even as a human being, anything can be done with them. So I wanted to show that that the strength, the weight of power, is felt on the weaker part of humanity, on the subaltern humanity, in this brutal way. It's a huge weight. And so for that reason, I actually hand painted with watercolor each brick to make it look as the 19th century brick that I found there. And I wanted this to feel that it is a thick wall. It's incredibly thick. It is like 2 feet thick. So the weight the hatred that is imposed on the migrants, it can be felt there.
Migration is something that is very, very important to you. If I think about what we talked about, the work Neither, when you talk about the migration in the beginning of our conversation of 4 million displaced people from Venezuela living unprotected in an unprotected way in Colombia. Migration is something for you that is important as you describe yourself as a secondary witness and a secondary voice, but it's also important for you as a person. You describe yourself in the beginning of your career more so very often as an artist from a third world country. What does migration, and perhaps we go to the next slide, because I think this is, for me, such an incredibly important piece, Shibboleth, you did at the Tate Modern, which created this crack. And if we go to the next slide, I couldn't believe how you actually did this, because it looks like an earthquake happened and the floor of the Tate just moved like several inches, moved out, because of course the halves are exactly matching. It's not that you dug a hole or you didn't, it's two halves, it's two perfect halves that you created. So you created really something that looks as if there was no gap before there. And then, of course, if we go to the next slide, looking really, really closely into the interior of this, you see that there must have been some structure to even create this. And then if we go to the next slide to see how this is actually functioning at the Tate. This is a work about migration. This is a work about crossing borders. Do you want to elaborate a bit on this, Doris?
Yes, once I was invited at the Tate, I was the first artist from the Global South to be invited to this space. And I was thinking of the history of the Tate, how Mr. Tate made the money to build his museum with the slave work in sugar fields in the Caribbean. So the whole, I was thinking of what the museum was. I was thinking of migration and how there will be a wire mesh everywhere to stop us from the Global South to go north. Even if the earth opens itself, there will be a mesh to prevent us from going. I was thinking also of our history. I was thinking that what we have been taught as universal art history is basically European art history. And this art history has managed to create a beautiful, extraordinarily brilliant image of white people, full of beauty, of life, of divinity even. And on the other hand, there are not very many images, very few images of people who look like me. So I can think of maybe the Juan de Parejas, the Velázquez piece that is at the Met, of a person that looks like me. And in general, all the darker people on this earth. I think art also has helped the creation of this terrible invention, which is race and racism. So for me, racism was very important in this piece. So for us, the darker, the non-white people on earth, we will never be allowed not only to enter Europe of the state, but life itself. It's like we are forced to live in the periphery of the cities, in the periphery of life, no matter what conditions, no matter the necessities. Somebody might be, it's a person who has been tortured and needs to leave the country. Well, the doors will be closed because people, even though humanity has always moved, now after the invasion of race, all the black and brown people of this planet, we are all of a sudden, we're not allowed to move. Mobility is not, it's only for capital. Mobility is only for goods, but not for human beings. And we are deemed illegal. So all these ideas were part of this project. And the idea that also we are considered an underclass. I mean, that term, that word, the fact that somebody thought of that word, underclass, and that we are that underclass, it's terrible. So it is clear to me that we occupy a negative space in this world. And we are forced into the areas that have been devastated, whose value has been extracted, and we are forced to live in the worst of conditions. So that's why I made this piece. All these ideas were mixed together.
You explained the title once. You basically said, and correct me if I paraphrase it the wrong way, you said Shibboleth is from the Bible, and when one of the Israeli tribes had to cross the Jordan, and they were basically asked, crossing the border, crossing the river, crossing the gaps, the crack in the earth, they were asked pronounce Shibboleth, and they couldn't pronounce it. They would say Sibboleth, and they were more than 40,000 people were killed.
Yeah, that's the biggest massacre that the Bible describes, but this type of word has been used in many other massacres. Now, not only in the Bible, but in reality. For example, going from Santo Domingo to Haiti, Haitians were forced to pronounce the word perejil, and they couldn't say it. They couldn't say perejil, so they will be murdered on the spot. Here, in the wars of independence in Colombia, the natives were forced to pronounce the word Zaragoza, the way the Spaniards pronounce it, and since we were not allowed, people were killed on the spot. So it is the word that describes the impossibility of crossing borders and the imposition of death as you cross, as you attempt to cross a border.
What an incredibly strong work. You were preparing this work when I was last in your studio, Plegaria Muda, the silent prayer, and more than 100 of these double tables. They kind of have the dimension, each table has the dimension that a body could lie on it. They have kind of the dimension of a coffin. And so you have one table standing and you have a layer of soil, a layer of earth between the two tables, and then there is a table upside down on top of this layer of soil. So two tables each. And if we go to this next slide, see the detail and the following one. You see the grass growing through this table. This has become such an incredibly known piece, Doris. Would you, and I know that this piece is actually, if we are, our Zoom, you are in the countryside near Bogota, I'm in Los Angeles here at MOCA. And this is actually a piece, if we go 2 slides back, this is actually a piece that has its origin in Los Angeles. You were in Los Angeles before you started on this work, and you visited Southeast LA, and you were doing your research here. What brought you to LA, and what brought you to conceive this piece based on your experience in Los Angeles?
I was visiting LA because I was part of the board of the Hammer Museum. So I was visiting LA quite often. And as I was visiting LA, I was shocked by the level of violence that was experienced in the streets of LA. And I always like to connect what is happening in Colombia to what is happening in other parts of the world. And then I realized that people who were poor, black and brown, were killing each other, basically for no reason. And I thought that these gang wars were a fratricidal war, just like a civil war is, a fratricidal war. And I realized that poor people kill each other because there is a really fluid swap of roles. The victim can become the perpetrator. One day you're perpetrator, next day you're victim. And this is something that happens in extreme poverty. It happens very easily. So these lives were superfluous. And there was something happening as I was noticing that in LA. It was a terrible event that took place in Bogota during the government, the right-wing government of Álvaro Uribe. 6,400 young poor men were killed by the Colombian army. And then they were dressed, once they were killed, they were dressed as guerrillas and were presented as guerrillas discharged in combat. So this is more, to me, it's an idea that is even worse that Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil, because the army was getting money, vacations, little prizes for killing these young people, all the youngsters. And they were fun. I was at the time interviewing a group of mothers, and this group of mothers, the only thing they knew was that their son had disappeared. So I started traveling with these mothers all over Colombia. They were searching for the disappeared sons. When finally there was a confession, and we found mass graves where the body of some of these young men were abandoned by the Colombian army. And then I wanted to give a single grave to every life, because as poor people in life have to be, their existence happens in cramped places. They don't have a space to live. Then when they die, they don't have a space for the death. I wanted each single tomb to be marked and to honor these lives in that way. So to show that a funerary ritual took place, maybe a precarious one because the piece is quite poor, but nonetheless a funerary rite took place, and that was very important for me. I have always been struck by this idea that Jean Améry, a survivor of Auschwitz, repeats. He said that he wrote that if there is the aesthetic of death points towards the ethics of which a life has been bestowed with. And evidently, if you throw bodies into a mass grave, of course, there's no ethics of death. And of course, there's no aesthetics of death, and of course, no ethics of life. If you see the funeral of an important person is a huge, huge, huge performance, huge ritual, but poor people don't have that. And so I think art has the task to present every aspect of human life. If it is not presented in art, it doesn't exist. We humans need to recognize that. And then I realized that the mass grave was never being represented in art. So I wanted to make a huge mass grave that nonetheless mark each tomb individually. So there are 164 of these pieces, and as you walk through this, like this sea or labyrinth of graves, you're not walking on the grave, but you are in the grave. And for me, this idea that the mass grave had to be represented was what motivated the making of these pieces. And of course, some life had to come through it, because art is the continuation of life. Art is what gives us hope. It's what it joins together the death, the violent death of a person with our current present condition. So it is like life could be continuous, could be immortal actually, if it continues in a work of art.
Silent Prayer is the title of this, your indeed very timeless work. This piece does not age at all. Radical, you use the word radical silence often to describe your work. What is a moment of silence that you try to create with your work? What does it mean for you?
Well, my work in most of my work is related to death, and death is silence. It is related to violent death, and violent death is marks the absence of language. A victim cannot say, please don't kill me, I didn't do it, I'm sorry. The victim is not granted the possibility of an apology. The victim is killed without a word. The victim is not heard. So that radical silence belongs to violent death. And I think art has to be radically silenced as well, because if I allowed my work to narrate one single experience, then that narration of the experience of a single victim will block or will negate the experience of more victims. So I need my work to be silent in order to be strangely neutral. So it is neutral because it doesn't narrate, and nonetheless it addresses an extreme experience, but it needs to be silent.
In this work, thank you so much, Doris. This is incredible elaboration on this. In this work, A Flor de Piel, which somehow translates to, perhaps it's very difficult to translate, but it's like carrying your emotions on your skin, perhaps, like being obviously emotional about something. And there was a nurse that was murdered, but not, the nurse was tortured and dismembered, and then the dismembered corpse was found. And you wanted to memorialize, or you wanted to create that space of giving the dignity back to this victim of torture and having been killed and dismembered. What you did is you, like in the work, in the beautiful memorial to Jaime Garzón, where you put miles of roses through the city, you used rose petals. And I hope I'm allowed to say this, so you treated them with collagen, so they wouldn't decay further. So they're caught a little bit between life and being a dead or a living object, because they are conserved with the collagen as a preservative. And then if you go to the next slide, we see that you sutured, like a very medical process, these beautiful rose petals into a shroud, if we go for the next one, which by itself, a shroud sutured, sewn together of rose petals, might be the most fragile, vulnerable object you can imagine, because I think if you even touch it, you will destroy it partially. And perhaps we have the video that you gave us so kindly run while you talk a bit about it.
Okay. Yes, I was researching on this nurse who had been, as you say, tortured and dismembered, but her body has not been found. So I was thinking that I wanted to do something very simple. It was to present a flower offering to this victim who inhabits a limbo, because when a body has not been found, they inhabit this liminal space. And in a way, I wanted the rose petal to inhabit the same space, so not dead, not alive, but just suspended. like the disappeared, like the bodies of the disappeared people. At the time, I was amazed because you had in the States this really extraordinary discussion in newspapers and in the political spheres of about torture. During the Bush administration, there was a lot of talk about what is torture. If I inflict a pain on a person, extreme pain on a person, but I don't intend to inflict harm, I don't know how that can happen. But that was the argument that the Bush administration, and especially Rumsfeld at the time, had. I was shocked. How can we talk about torture? Do we really know what a tortured person feels? Do we really know how the person feels? Can we even approach a wooden body? If it is, you have a wound that is open, how can you touch it? Even to heal it, much less to inflict harm. So I was really obsessed by this idea. There's nothing more fragile and more vulnerable than a human body that is being tortured. So I wanted to make a piece that it was equally fragile, equally impossible, absurdly fragile. So we start working in this incredibly difficult piece, and it forced us to move in a delicate way. Everything was delicate. Our movements were delicate. Um, Even you don't feel like talking too loud in front of this piece because you might harm it. It's very difficult to install because, as you say, it's hard to touch, just like a wound. But I wanted this wound to be the wound of this civilization. We are a society that is wounded.
What an incredible piece. What an incredible piece. Let's go to the next, and just in the interest of time, because we always have to kind of, like, all these studio visits have a certain duration. And I think you and we could continue until Monday, which I think we should do at some point, but let's do it once we can travel again. So these works, disremembered, incredibly fragile, incredibly also kind of hurtful objects, because what you see is here shirts that are woven out of silk thread, with each of this has like 12,000 needles. If we go for the next slide, you see the fragility is also harmful in a way. And let's go to the next slides. This beautiful installation you did, palimpsest, at Reina Sofia, the Crystal Palace in Madrid. And we see that you palimpsest, so go to the next slide. And to the next. You see that here the two different levels of writing on top of each other. And while we talk about it, we can have a video run where we see how you actually feed the writing with water from the ground from below. So let's watch the video, which is next. Creating this memorial space at the Reina Sofia, and here you see the water come out of the floor. And of course, the magician your studio work delivers is that you are doing this magical writing. Was this, for how long did this piece exist at Reina Sofia?
I don't recall, like 4 months, I believe.
Beautiful. What an incredible piece. You're always going for when you think about it in the beginning, for the impossible. Let's go to the next work, because I would like to also come back chronological. The Sum of Absences. And we selected like 6 slides. We can go through them. This was in 2016. 2016 was a very, very important year. There were negotiations, peace negotiations, finally, after 52 years of war. and FARC and the government didn't come to an agreement, and then later came to an agreement. And you were very present in the process. This is beautiful here, this aerial in Bogota.
Yeah, it was, the government signed an agreement with the guerrilla, and then there was a referendum, and people, a small majority voted for war. So this was a way to mourn the loss of the possibility of peace. In 2016, Colombia was in peace. We had no army casualties, no policemen that were killed. We had no kidnapping. It was a wonderful year. And then after the referendum, and right now we have full-blown war again. So I wanted to, I put together 0.7% of the casualties that we had suffered during the war, 0.7%. And that I wrote that in ashes. And because the names are already being forgotten. And then we stitch, I believe it was 15 kilometers of stitches to make this huge shroud that allowed the missing ones to be present in the space where the living make the demonstration. This is a really political space in Colombia. It's the space where we all go to demonstrate. And so the dead don't have that chance. So I wanted them to be present.
And in the moment of 2016, Nobel Peace Prize, it looked like a new beginning for Colombia. And if we go to the next group of slides, there was so much hope here in this work, Fragmentos from 2018, still thinking that the peace, of course, would last. And let's go to the next. You were looking at the confiscated weapons, and
they were not confiscated, they were given voluntarily, given by the army, by the guerrilla, sorry.
Oh, thank you so much. That's such an important difference, because it was a moment of peace.
Yeah.
And let's go to the next slide. And the next. What an image. So you basically melted 37 tons of voluntarily given guns, and created a work of art, Fragmentos. So these guns were melted, and we go to the next one. Here you see them in the process of melting. And the next one, please. And this is a video that we can talk over. But you see, what do we see, Doris? What do we see? What's happening?
You're seeing women who were sex slaves during the war, and they were enslaved by different armies, the guerrilla, the Colombian army, or the paramilitaries. They were, so this, I thought that rape has not been acknowledged as a political crime. It's usually a crime that is thought to be private or domestic somehow. And I wanted to show that it is a political crime. So we hammer these metal plates, and out of them I make molds. And we melted this weaponry into these molds to create a space. So this is the floor of a space that is a contemporary art museum. Right now we have a show of Francis Alice in Fragmentos. Artists who make work on war, about war, will be presented in this space. But it was important that the shape was given by the victims. So me as an artist, I'm behind the scenes. Actually, the victims are the ones who are giving shape. It's a truly collective work, and this is what I really like about this, because Carlos Granada, the architect, designed the building. As you see now, there are some ruins that were made by an anonymous person. We don't know who. The ruins were there, and then the victims participated, and now the artists who present their work put their work on top of mine. So I'm completely erased as an artist. And this is something that is very important. I don't exist there.
You don't exist, but your statement exists as fragmentos in a time where, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if I observe it from the outside correctly, unfortunately, the peace didn't last. So this monument reminding everybody and being based on the guns freely given back for peace, how does the work feel for you now that the peace seems it's not necessarily stable?
We lost peace. And when I make when I make fragmentos, I thought there was a piece that signaled the end of a process. The peace process was finished, and this was the result. Now I realize that fragmentos is our map, our route for the future. We have to understand that the only way out of war is peace. There's no other way but sign peace agreements. This is the testament that if we did it once, we can do it again and again and again in terms of the Colombian reality, but also in terms of the international reality. Wouldn't it be wonderful to melt all the gangs that are in the States, for example? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to make work of art out of these gangs so no more people should be killed? So it is a piece that talks about the future. It gives us a hint of what we should be doing, not only Colombia, but all over the world.
That's beautiful. We have two more slides. And tabula rasa, you sometimes say that you start every work as a tabula rasa, but this work is really titled this way. And we go to the next slide to see a detail of this table, and you see that this table had been completely destroyed into bits and pieces, like a puzzle, like a three-dimensional puzzle, and puzzled back together. So we go to the next slide. This is actually, you said before, art is such a strong form of hope. And of course, seeing these works and the impossibility, what you and your team achieved here. So we go to the last slide. And you see the incredibly small thousands of pieces that you reconfigured this table. What does this work refer to, Doris, for you? What does it,
I
where
was
is it grounded?
interviewing victims of rape, again, the same group of women that I work fragmentos with. I was interviewing them, and then I realized that they had been killed. Even if the victim physically survives the attack, whatever they were before the attack is completely murder. And they have to start all over again. They have to put together themselves, bits and parts of themselves, to create a new being, the person who survives the attack, and to create a new life. But this new life is fragile, and there are parts that are missing. There are bits that will never be recovered. And I realize they don't only have one wound, but they are completely wounded. They're deeply and profoundly scarred. So this is really the condition of the victim. People who have suffered enormously, and nonetheless they stand up, they work, they go out, they try to have a life, even though the trauma and the pain is eating them away, it's destroying them. So I wanted to show that the destruction and the mending go together and create this tension in these pieces. These pieces are almost trembling. And this is the way life goes. Sorry?
What keeps you hopeful? Because you are so close to so much pain and suffering and mourning. What keeps you strong and hopeful, Doris? Because you were so kind to walk us through 30 years of your work, of your practice. And what keeps you hopeful and strong?
I think it's art, is the possibility that we humans have to create a language, musical, verbal, or sculptural. As long as we narrate what happened to us, we will, life will subsist. Maybe in the infamy in which it existed, but it subsists. And that's what allows me to go on in the midst of so much pain, is the possibility of narrating. If we narrate, if we represent, if we address, if we tell the story of what happened to us, we will remain human and life will be honored. So it's this need, this deep need to honor these lives, what keeps me going.
Thank you.
Thank
Wow,
you.
that was really an incredible statement. Thank you, thank you, thank you for this visit.